Hello, this is Chris Wilhelm, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the Friday, March 20th issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Our first story, White House looks for ways to soothe American jitters over surging prices. President Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel suggested that the war with Iran could end soon, but that there were still more attacks ahead. By Tony Rahm, David E. Sanger, and Michael Levinson. The White House raced to find ways to reassure Americans as oil prices seesawed again on Thursday after a series of Iranian strikes on oil and gas facilities deepened a global energy crisis nearly 3 weeks into the U.S.-Israeli war with Iran. President Trump, speaking during an Oval Office meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, said that he would do whatever was necessary to ease the crisis, but that it was temporary. "I thought there was a chance it could be much worse," he said. "It's not bad, and it's going to be over with pretty soon." Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel said at a news conference on Thursday that the war would end a lot faster than people think, though he did not offer a concrete timeline. He said that Iran no longer has the ability to enrich uranium or manufacture ballistic missiles, but there's still more work to do, and we're going to do it. He spoke after Iran hit oil and gas facilities in Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates on Wednesday and Thursday in retaliation for an Israeli strike on the South Pars natural gas field, a vast gas reservoir in the Persian Gulf that supplies Iran with much of the energy for its businesses and homes. The strikes further rattled global energy markets, which have already been shaken by Iran's effective blockade of most Western oil shipments in the Strait of Hormuz, a conduit for about 1/5 of the world's oil. Oil prices have been surging since the start of the conflict on February 28th, with international crude futures up close to 50% in less than 3 weeks. As crude rises, so do gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel, driving up the prices of everyday goods. On Thursday, the average price of a gallon of gas in the United States hit $3.88, up from $2.93 a month ago. Mortgage rates also jumped this week, the third increase in a row, as high oil and gas prices weighed on housing costs for Americans. The shock to household budgets is unlikely to deter homebuyers for now, experts said, but the longer this goes on, the more it's likely to affect buyer behavior, said Michael Pierce, the chief U.S. economist at Oxford Economics. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told Fox Business that the Trump administration, in an effort to lower prices, may remove sanctions on Iranian oil that was already being shipped, about 140 million barrels. The strategy would be a sharp reversal from years of tough sanctions aimed at crippling Iran's economy. Mr. Bessent said he hoped that increasing the supply of oil on global markets would make up for what Iran was obstructing through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran sells most of its oil to China, but Mr. Bessent said that unsanctioned oil could go to countries such as Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Japan, and India. Mr. Bessent said that the United States could also release more oil from its own strategic reserves, on top of the 172 million barrels it has already pledged to tap earlier this month. He floated the ideas as the Pentagon asked for $200 billion in additional funding for the war, according to a military official and an administration official. The sum, which is nearly a quarter of the entire annual U.S. defense budget, must be reviewed by the White House before it is formally submitted to Congress. Obviously, it takes money to kill bad guys, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said when asked about the request on Thursday, adding, "As far as the $200 billion, I think that number could move." Mr. Hegseth declined to offer a timeline for when the war might end, but the request suggested the U.S. military was preparing for a long campaign. Mr. Trump told reporters on Thursday that the funding would be a small price to pay to make sure that we stay tippy-top. Asked about using ground troops in Iran, Mr. Trump said, "I'm not putting troops anywhere. If I did, I wouldn't tell you." On Tuesday, he said he was not afraid to deploy U.S. troops to Iran. The Trump administration on Thursday also moved to send more weapons to Middle Eastern allies, which have been targeted by Iranian missiles and drones. The State Department said that it had declared an emergency to allow it to bypass Congress and sell about $16 billion in munitions, counter-drone technology, medium-range missiles, and air and missile defense systems to the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Jordan. The department declared a similar emergency to advance an arms sale to Israel earlier this month. The Trump administration has also been pressing Japan for military assistance in the Middle East, possibly by sending minesweepers to the Strait of Hormuz. While an end to the war could reopen oil shipments in the Strait of Hormuz, economists are also worried that Iran's attacks may cause lasting damage to valuable oil and gas sites in the Persian Gulf. Qatar, a major global energy supplier, said that Iranian attacks had damaged its gas sites, including the Bas Rafan terminal, the world's largest liquefied natural gas facility. Saad Sharida Al-Kaabi, the chief executive of Qatar Energy, a state-owned energy company, told Reuters that the attacks had knocked out nearly a fifth of the company's liquefied natural gas export capacity, and that repairs would take 3 to 5 years. Drone attacks this week also caused fires at 2 state-owned refineries in Kuwait, and a drone fell at a key energy export terminal in Saudi Arabia. In the United Arab Emirates, officials reported that gas facilities and an oil field were struck by debris from missile interceptions. And in Israel on Thursday, a fire broke out at an oil refinery that was hit by an Iranian missile fragment, officials said. Saudi Arabia's foreign minister, Prince Faisal bin Farhan, warned that his government had limited patience with Iran and reserved the right to take military actions if deemed necessary. "We will not shy away from protecting our country and our economic resources," he said at a news conference on Thursday. When asked what would prompt a military response, the prince declined to elaborate. "Do they have a day, 2, a week?" he asked. "I'm not going to telegraph that." He added that what little trust there was between the kingdom and Iran had completely been shattered. The countries reestablished diplomatic relations in 2023. The attack on South Pars gas field infuriated not only Iran, but also Qatar, a U.S. ally which shares ownership of the field, and called the strike a dangerous and irresponsible step that could threaten global energy security. Mr. Trump sent conflicting messages about whether the United States knew ahead of time about the attack on South Pars. In a social media post late Wednesday, he wrote that the United States knew nothing about it and that Israel had violently lashed out. Speaking from the Oval Office on Thursday, Mr. Trump said that he had talked about the South Pars strike with Mr. Netanyahu, but he was not clear about when they spoke. "I told him don't do that," Mr. Trump said. Mr. Netanyahu later said that Mr. Trump had asked Israel to hold off further attacks on the South Pars facility and that Israel would respect that. 3 Israeli officials briefed on it said on Thursday that the United States was informed before the attack. They spoke on the condition of anonymity because of the sensitive diplomacy. Homeland Security nominee clears key hurdle. If confirmed, Senator Markwayne Mullin of Oklahoma would be taking over the department at a sensitive moment. By Madeline Goh and Michael Gold. Senators moved to speed the nomination of Markwayne Mullin, President Trump's pick to lead the Homeland Security Department, to the Senate floor, setting him up to take over the agency at the center of Mr. Trump's mass deportation campaign. The Senate Homeland Security Committee voted 8-7 to send Mr. Mullin's nomination to the Senate with a favorable recommendation, with most Republicans and 1 Democrat voting to advance the nomination. Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, the committee's Republican chairman, defected from his party and voted in opposition. Mr. Mullin retained sufficient support on the committee, however, with the backing of Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania, a Democrat. Mr. Mullin is expected to face a confirmation vote in the Senate next week. Mr. Mullin, who is well liked personally by his Senate colleagues, was expected to be swiftly confirmed. But that trajectory was briefly in doubt on Wednesday when Mr. Mullin clashed with Mr. Paul over his temperament and comments he made about experiencing a war zone, even though he has no military background. Mr. Paul threatened to hold up the vote if Mr. Mullen did not elaborate on a trip he took overseas while a member of the House, which Mr. Mullen said was classified. Mr. Paul and Senator Gary Peters of Michigan, the top Democrat on the panel, demanded that Mr. Mullen disclose details in a secure room after the hearing. Mr. Paul later told reporters he planned to vote against Mr. Mullen's confirmation. If confirmed, Mr. Mullen would be taking over the Homeland Security Department at a sensitive moment. Under the departing Secretary, Kristi Noem, the department advanced Mr. Trump's goal of imposing stricter immigration policies, drastically reducing illegal border crossings, and ramping up hiring of immigration and customs enforcement officers. But polling has shown a drop in support for the agency. After a year of sweeping immigration enforcement actions in Democratic-led cities, including Los Angeles, Chicago, and Minneapolis. The department drew criticism from members of both parties after 2 U.S. citizens were fatally shot by immigration officers amid protests in Minnesota. Democrats in Congress have refused to allow funding to flow to the department since February 14th, demanding new restrictions on immigration enforcement. Mr. Mullen is a stalwart supporter of Mr. Trump, who called him a MAGA warrior. He has been a staunch defender of the Trump administration's mass deportation campaign and has criticized Democratic-run cities and states for refusing to cooperate with federal immigration officials. But at his confirmation hearing on Wednesday, he tried to strike a more cooperative tone and suggested he would break with some of the practices of Ms. Noem, whom Mr. Trump ousted this month amid questions about the department's spending and strategies. He told senators that under his leadership, immigration officers would generally no longer enter homes without a judicial warrant. He said the Homeland Security Department would foster closer relationships with jails, suggesting a move away from major urban sweeps. He also pledged to revoke a policy that has slowed the flow of disaster relief funds through the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which the Homeland Security Department oversees. Mr. Mullen was sworn in as a senator in 2023, after a decade of serving in the House. He is the second Cherokee Nation citizen to serve in the Senate, according to his website. He grew up on his family's ranch in Westville, Oklahoma, and attended college on a wrestling scholarship before his father became ill. He postponed his studies to take over his family business, Mullen Plumbing. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Lawsuit accuses Justice Department leadership of political retribution. The suit filed by 2 fired FBI agents aimed to hold the Trump administration accountable for the purge of personnel who had worked on the investigations of Mr. Trump or his allies. By Alan Foyer. 2 former FBI agents fired last year for having worked on an investigation into President Trump's attempts to overturn his loss in the 2020 election accused senior leaders at the Bureau and the Justice Department of targeting them for political retribution in a lawsuit filed on Thursday. In their suit, the agents claimed that the FBI Director, Kash Patel, and Attorney General Pam Bondi had retaliated against them for being politically disloyal to President Trump, even though they had worked on the election interference case, known as Arctic Frost, only briefly and in largely administrative roles. The suit, filed in federal district court in Washington, was the latest effort by FBI employees to hold Mr. Patel and Ms. Bondi accountable for the sweeping purge of investigators and analysts who lost their jobs because they had taken part in inquiries into Mr. Trump or his allies. Dozens of agents and prosecutors who worked on the investigations have been fired or forced from their positions in a campaign of retribution that began almost immediately after Mr. Trump returned to the White House. Political support for President Trump is not a legal or appropriate requirement for the effective performance of plaintiffs' respective roles within the FBI, the lawsuit said. Accordingly, perceived lack of political support for President Trump is an impermissible basis for termination of plaintiffs' FBI employment. The agents filed the suit, which asks a federal judge to reinstate them at the FBI under the pseudonyms John Doe 1 and John Doe 2, because they say they have faced threats on social media from members of the public calling for their imprisonment, even their execution. Their lawyers say that threats came after Mr. Trump, Mr. Patel, and others described many of the agents who had worked on Arctic Frost as being corrupt actors or taking part in a political witch hunt. Arctic Frost was one of 2 investigations that were ultimately led by the special counsel Jack Smith, who was appointed to investigate Mr. Trump in November 2022. It resulted in Mr. Trump's indictment on charges of plotting to disrupt the lawful transfer of presidential power in 2020. Mr. Smith also conducted another inquiry, known as Plasmic Echo, that led to a separate indictment accusing Mr. Trump of illegally holding on to classified documents after he left the White House in 2021. Both cases were dismissed after Mr. Trump was reelected. Nearly a dozen FBI employees who had worked on the Plasmic Echo case were fired by Mr. Patel last month. The Arctic Frost complaint describes how John Doe 1 got a phone call in October from a senior FBI official ordering him to immediately report to the Washington field office. It was Halloween, and the agent was preparing to go trick-or-treating with his 2 young children, but he left them behind in their costumes to go to the field office, where he was presented with a termination letter. You have exercised poor judgment and a lack of impartiality in carrying out duties, leading to the political weaponization of the government, the letter said. It contained no allegations of misconduct and simply asserted that the agent was being fired under Article 2 of the Constitution, which details the powers of the executive branch. John Doe 2 was fired a few days later through a similar letter, the lawsuit said, and despite an attempt to save his job by Jeanine Pirro, the Trump-appointed U.S. attorney in Washington, with whom he had been working on a high-profile government fraud investigation. The lawsuit accused Mr. Patel, in particular, of going back on the vow he had made under oath during his Senate confirmation hearing last January not to fire any agents solely because of cases they may have worked on. And it noted that Ms. Bondi had been threatening, as early as March 2025, to fire agents who had worked on Trump-related cases. There are a lot of people in the FBI and also in the Department of Justice who despise Donald Trump, despise us, don't want to be here, she said that month during an interview on Fox News. Right now, she added, we're going to root them out. We will find them and they will no longer be employed. While some senior agents with supervisory roles in the inquiries into Mr. Trump were ultimately fired, John Doe 1 and John Doe 2 largely did administrative work on the Arctic Frost case, according to the lawsuit. John Doe 1, the suit asserted, helped 2 lead agents download information obtained from subpoenas and store it in a shared digital folder where the rest of the investigative team could gain access to it. John Doe 2 was responsible, the suit said, for jobs like recording interviews and arranging for their transcription. Their lawsuit also claimed that Senator Charles E. Grassley of Iowa, the powerful Republican chairman of the Judiciary Committee, had worked in apparent coordination with Mr. Patel and Mr. Trump to target and disparage FBI personnel involved with Arctic Frost. From the moment Mr. Patel assumed his job atop the FBI, it said, Mr. Grassley began releasing records related to the Arctic Frost case, some of which had been given to Congress by a purported whistleblower. Mr. Grassley has requested information about the inquiry since 2022 and repeatedly expressed frustration with the Biden administration's refusal to turn over internal documents. But under Mr. Patel, FBI agents have been poring over case files, internal Justice Department correspondence, and other sensitive materials to find documents intended to expose and discredit federal law enforcement officials who investigated Mr. Trump and his allies. Even after several rounds of firings, Mr. Trump has continued to disparage the FBI agents who worked on the investigations into him, the lawsuit pointed out. It noted that in January, he posted a link to an article about Arctic Frost on social media and assailed the investigators on the case. These FBI agents are total scum, in their own way no better than the insurrectionists in Portland, Minnesota, Los Angeles, etc., he wrote. Cash better get them out now. 24 states sue the EPA for renouncing its power to fight climate change. The suit accuses the agency of illegally repealing the endangerment finding, the scientific assessment that required it to regulate greenhouse gases. By Lisa Friedman. A coalition of 24 states, along with a dozen cities and counties, sued the Trump administration on Thursday over its decision to relinquish the government's legal authority to fight climate change. The lawsuit was filed in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. It is expected to be consolidated with a case that environmental groups filed in February, making for one of the largest legal challenges to date against the Trump administration's unraveling of federal climate policy. The states are arguing that the Environmental Protection Agency acted illegally when it rescinded a 2009 scientific conclusion that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases threaten public health and welfare. That determination, known as the endangerment finding, formed the legal basis for the EPA to regulate emissions from automobile tailpipes, power plant smokestacks, oil and gas wells, and other sources. Decades of scientific research has found that emissions from burning fossil fuels are warming the atmosphere, acidifying the oceans, and supercharging heat waves, droughts, wildfires, and other extreme weather. The lawsuit seeks to reinstate the endangerment finding, forcing the Trump administration to retain the government's authority to regulate greenhouse gas pollution even if it doesn't exercise that power. The suit also seeks to reverse a related EPA move that repealed limits on greenhouse gases produced by motor vehicles. Transportation is the largest single source of greenhouse gases in the United States, accounting for more than a third of total climate pollution. The endangerment finding is critical for us to protect the health and well-being of our families, of our kids. Andrea Joy Campbell, the Attorney General of Massachusetts, which is leading the lawsuit along with California, New York, and Connecticut, said in an interview. She accused the EPA of blatant violations of the law in repealing it. The EPA came out with no new science, no new law or legal precedent that would allow them to walk away from the endangerment finding, said Ms. Campbell, a Democrat, like all the officials who joined the litigation. Across our country, communities are already suffering from climate disasters, Letitia James, the New York Attorney General, said in a statement. Instead of helping Americans face our new reality, the Trump administration has chosen denial, repealing critical protections that are foundational to the federal government's response to climate change. The Trump administration has already begun to repeal federal rules imposed by the Biden administration on cars and trucks, coal-fired power plants, and other sources of climate pollution. But getting rid of the endangerment finding was seen as a way to tear out climate regulations at their roots. That's because, if courts uphold the repeal, the EPA would have no legal authority to regulate greenhouse gases, and future presidents would not be able to restore limits on them through the federal rulemaking process. Bridget Hirsch, a spokeswoman for the EPA, said in a statement that the agency conducted a robust analysis of the law and concluded that the Clean Air Act does not allow it to regulate vehicle emissions for the purpose of addressing climate change. In the absence of such authority, the endangerment finding is not valid, and EPA cannot retain the regulations that resulted from it, Ms. Hirsch said. The United States is currently the world's second largest climate polluter after China. It also is the world's biggest historic emitter since the Industrial Revolution, responsible for more than 20% of all carbon dioxide emissions since 1751. That distinction matters because past emissions of long-lived greenhouse gases significantly contribute to current and future warming. President Trump has called climate change a hoax, and his cabinet secretaries have claimed the planet's rapid warming is having little effect on humanity. But the EPA didn't make those arguments when it repealed the endangerment finding, and instead zeroed in on the law. The agency declared that the Clean Air Act of 1970 allows the government to limit only pollution that causes direct harm to Americans. Greenhouse gases, which collect in the atmosphere to form a blanket-like layer that traps heat from the Earth's surface and carry global effects, do not meet that criteria, the agency argued. In the lawsuit, the state said that opponents of tackling climate change already tried to use the EPA's argument nearly 2 decades ago when they sought to prevent the government from being able to address climate change. The Supreme Court rejected the move in a landmark 2007 case known as Massachusetts v. EPA. Justices in that case found that greenhouse gases are air pollutants under the Clean Air Act, and that the agency could regulate such emissions if they were found to endanger human health or the environment. The EPA would have to make that determination, they ruled. 2 years later, the EPA issued a nearly 200-page scientific analysis concluding that 6 specific greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide and methane, endanger current and future generations. The states may prevail in lower court, Richard Lazarus, a professor of environmental law at Harvard Law School, said, but legal experts widely believe that the Trump administration's goal is to get the case heard by the Supreme Court in the hopes that the conservative majority will reverse the 2007 ruling, which was decided on a 5-4 vote. None of the justices who voted in the majority then are still on the court. It's really hard to say what the Supreme Court would do, but it's certainly an open issue for them, Mr. Lazarus said. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Trump jokes about Pearl Harbor in meeting with Japan's leader. Breaking a taboo, President Trump needled Japan's prime minister about the World War II attack as she widened her eyes and appeared to take a deep breath in the Oval Office. By Javier C. Hernandez. For decades, American presidents have avoided speaking harshly about Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, eager to focus instead on deepening ties with Tokyo, which has been a steadfast ally since World War II. Not so with President Trump. At an otherwise congenial meeting with Japan's Prime Minister, Sanai Takaichi, in the Oval Office on Thursday, Mr. Trump invoked the Japanese attack on December 7, 1941, which led the United States into World War II. He was responding to a question from a reporter about why Japan and other allies had received no advance notice of the U.S.-Israeli assault on Iran. "We didn't tell anybody about it because we wanted surprise," he said. "Who knows better about surprise than Japan, okay? Why didn't you tell me about Pearl Harbor, okay, right?" There was some laughter from the officials and journalists gathered in the room. "You believe in surprise, I think, much more so than us," he added. As Mr. Trump spoke, Ms. Takaichi widened her eyes and appeared to take a deep breath. She kept her arms crossed in her lap and did not speak. The remark was the latest example of Mr. Trump's penchant for tossing aside diplomatic norms. After the end of World War II, President Harry S. Truman used the attack on Pearl Harbor to justify American efforts to remake Japanese society and to impose a pacifist constitution. The United States led the Allies' occupation of Japan from 1945 until 1952. The Constitution forced Japan to renounce war and put limits on its military, making Tokyo reliant on the United States for protection. But during the Cold War, the United States shifted its official portrayal of the attack, describing it as a historical tragedy rather than pointing fingers at Japan. American officials were eager to keep Tokyo as an ally as communism spread in Asia and to form security and economic pacts. In 2016, 75 years after Imperial Japanese warplanes damaged the Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor, President Barack Obama visited the site of the attack with Shinzo Abe, then Japan's prime minister, who offered condolences to the souls of those who lost their lives here. Mr. Obama and Mr. Abe laid wreaths made of white peace lilies at the memorial. Mr. Obama described in detail what occurred on the day of the attack, highlighted acts of heroism by American service members, and said that the visit of Mr. Abe reminds us of what is possible between nations and between peoples. Mr. Trump's predecessors have avoided speaking at length about Pearl Harbor in the presence of Japanese leaders because there's been a really profound process of reconciliation between the United States and Japan, said Mireya Solis, director of the Center for Asia Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution in Washington. Mr. Trump's remarks were unusual, a shock, she said. The purpose of this visit is to emphasize the shared vision, the strong bonds that unite Japan and the United States, she said, not the divisive past and the bitter rivalry and conflict of the war. U.S. encourages flow of Iranian oil while it battles Iran. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said removing sanctions on Iranian oil would lower global prices. By Alan Rappaport. The Trump administration said on Thursday that it planned to remove sanctions on Iranian oil, an unorthodox move intended to lower surging crude prices, which have hurt U.S. consumers and helped Iran profit. The strategy would be a sharp reversal from years of maximum pressure sanctions aimed to cripple Iran's economy. The plan, described by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, reflects the administration's desperation to reduce oil prices, encouraging Iran to sell more oil even while it is at war with the United States. Since the war started late last month, Iran has continued to export its oil, most of which is sold to China despite U.S. sanctions. But the confrontation with Iran has revealed an economic paradox. Because the war has caused global oil prices to surge, Iran has actually been profiting from it. In essence, we will be using the Iranian barrels against the Iranians to keep the price down for the next 10 or 14 days as we continue this campaign, Mr. Bessent said in an interview on Fox Business, adding that the administration had lots of levers and plenty more at its disposal. President Trump said on Thursday that the United States would do whatever is necessary to contain oil prices. Speaking at the White House, he said that he knew attacking Iran could affect the U.S. economy, but that the war was necessary. "I wanted to put out that fire," Mr. Trump said of Iran. "I said if I do that, oil prices will go up. The economy will go down a little bit. I thought it would be worse." Mr. Bessent said the sanctions exemption would apply to about 140 million barrels of Iranian oil that were currently at sea. The United States could also do another release of oil from its strategic petroleum reserve to add to global supplies, he said, but ruled out intervening financially in oil markets to lower prices. In an interview with CNBC this week, Mr. Bessent said the United States was allowing Iran fuel ships to travel through the Strait of Hormuz so the rest of the world had sufficient oil supplies. The plan to remove sanctions on Iran comes a week after the Trump administration temporarily eased sanctions on Russian oil. The United States is also working to ramp up the flow of oil being exported by Venezuela, which it now considers an ally, since it arrested President Nicolas Maduro in January and removed him from office. Mr. Bessent said he hoped that increasing the supply of oil on global markets would make up for what Iran was obstructing through the Strait of Hormuz. He added that the unsanctioned oil could go to countries such as Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Japan, and India. The idea demonstrates that the United States is trying to use every tool at its disposal to contain energy prices. However, it is not certain Mr. Bessent's plan will work. Removing sanctions on oil that is currently at sea will not increase the flow of production. Iran has proven to be adept at evading U.S. sanctions, suggesting that much of what it exports already reaches buyers. Iran will likely profit from these sales, thereby providing more money to fund its regime, the war, and its proxies, said Alex Zerdin, the founder of Capital Peak Strategies and a former official in the Treasury Department's Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. "I don't think this stopgap measure will provide the market with assurance." Oil prices have been hovering around $100 per barrel since the United States attacked Iran late last month. According to Lloyd's List Intelligence data, there have been more than 100 cargo transits through the Strait of Hormuz since March 1st. Energy analysts have estimated that Iran has earned more than $100 million per day from oil sales since the war started. "They are making money on this war because the price of oil is going up," said Robert Pape, a political science professor at the University of Chicago specializing in international security affairs. "That's just extra money in Iran's hands." Arguing that Iran is an even bigger oil hegemon, he added, "This is why Iran is more powerful today than before the war started." Mr. Bessent said sanctioned Iranian oil was currently sold at a discount. It is unclear whether removing the sanctions, which could make oil legal to buy globally, would serve to curb Iran's profits. Edward Fishman, a senior fellow and the director of the Maurice R. Greenberg Center for Geoeconomic Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, said there was not enough oil at sea to make up for the 10 million barrels per day that Iran was obstructing through the Strait of Hormuz. For that reason, he said, oil prices were unlikely to be affected by the easing of sanctions, and the incentives for Iran to continue sowing chaos in energy markets would continue. For the Iranians, this is further evidence that pushing up oil prices through further attacks on ships and regional oil facilities is their best strategic move, Mr. Fishman said. The dilemma for the Trump administration has parallels to what the Biden administration faced 4 years ago when it confronted Russia over its war with Ukraine. At the time, the United States and Western allies imposed crippling sanctions on Russia. They initially exempted its energy products in hopes of keeping global prices contained. Ultimately, a coalition from the Group of 7 nations developed a price cap mechanism that was intended to let Russia keep selling oil but limit its profits. The plan had limited success as Russia found ways to evade the restrictions with its shadow fleet of tankers. Ben Harris, who was an assistant secretary for economic policy and the chief economist at the Treasury Department in the Biden administration, said the current situation with Iran was more complicated because the country had shown a willingness to disrupt oil exports from others in the region. We didn't have to worry about Russia blowing up tankers in the straits, Mr. Harris said, noting that there was no way to ensure that oil could safely travel through the Strait of Hormuz. If the Iranians are unwilling to facilitate the trade, it's not going to happen. The political calculations that the Trump administration faces are similar to what the Biden administration dealt with in 2022, when oil prices were rising sharply before the midterm elections. There's nothing more salient than the price of retail gas, Mr. Harris said. The prospect of a global recession is real, and the thing is that it may be entirely out of our hands. Mr. Bessent argued on Thursday that U.S. economic growth could still surpass 3% in 2026, despite the disruption to energy markets. This is temporary, he said. We will move beyond this, and we will come out on the other side, and the growth will be better. The Iran war's economic threat to Europe and Asia. Inflation and its consequences for growth are a growing concern for countries where memories of the 2022 energy crisis are fresh. By Esha Nelson and River Akira Davis. For governments around the globe, the prospect of a prolonged war in the Middle East is raising the risk of fiscal strain on already stretched public budgets. Officials from London to Seoul to Bangkok are starting to grapple with a vexing dilemma. Spend more to shield citizens from surging energy costs, risking the ire of global debt investors, or choose fiscal discipline and face the political backlash that is certain to follow. No country is immune to the problem, but it is especially acute in countries throughout Europe and Asia where dependence on imported oil and gas is great and inflation is an economic and political concern. Governments with high debt levels are staring down creditors restless about public finances drawn down by military spending, critical public services, aging populations, and infrastructure investment. At the same time, the scars of the last energy crisis, which followed the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, are still visible. Some countries have moved quickly to offer relief to households as the war in the Middle East has escalated. Portugal has cut taxes on diesel. Greece has imposed a cap on corporate profit margins on the sale of fuel and some groceries. In South Korea, the government is considering expanding an energy voucher program for households. Fiscal space is important, but the political pressure here is a much more important driver, said Angel Talavera, the chief European economist at Oxford Economics, a research group. The threshold for action is much lower because prices have become a hugely contentious issue with voters. So far, fiscal interventions have been limited and skewed toward cutting fuel costs for drivers. Targeted support is affordable. But with Iran targeting major energy facilities and Qatar and Saudi Arabia in retaliation for airstrikes on its South Pars offshore gas field, disruptions to global energy flows are showing little sign of subsiding. Officials may soon have to make difficult choices between alleviating economic pain and reducing budgets for popular programs, potentially borrowing more in the process. Of the roughly 20% of global oil and liquefied natural gas that moves through the strait, about 80% is destined for Asian markets. Some Asian airlines are worried about running out of jet fuel. In Bangladesh, the government ordered fuel rationing and closed universities. Several local governments in the Philippines have shifted to 4-day work weeks. While European countries import relatively little oil and gas from the Middle East, energy prices have still surged. Analysts warn that European buyers will face heavy competition from Asian importers for supplies from other parts of the world, further driving up prices. Sander Tordoir, chief economist at the Center for European Reform, a research institute, said Europe's overall public finances are in good shape, but that a repeat of the level of relief that governments provided consumers and businesses in 2022 would raise troubling prospects. In the European Union, energy subsidies nearly doubled to €397 billion, or $457 billion, in 2022 from a year earlier. Over 2 years, the British government provided about £75 billion, $100 billion, of support, including subsidizing household energy bills. If that's the kind of order of magnitude that European countries will have to spend on this, it is doable but painful, Mr. Tordoir said. The starkest example may be Britain. This week, its government announced £53 million to help those who depend on heating oil, an acute problem in Northern Ireland. But it has so far stopped short of wider changes, such as postponing an upcoming increase in fuel taxes for drivers. The British government has bound itself to strict fiscal rules to appease bond investors who are wary of the country's high debt levels and low growth outlook. Britain's bond yields tend to rise more sharply than those of its neighbors in a sell-off, driving up borrowing costs. Last year, the government was spending £1 in every £10 on debt interest payments. Now, just as the fiscal picture is starting to improve, the war in Iran risks derailing it. The UK is especially vulnerable, Mr. Tordoir said. Germany, Europe's largest economy, has very little fiscal leeway, said Marcel Fratscher, the president of the German Institute for Economic Research. In 2022, Germany slashed taxes on gasoline and diesel for a few months, costing €3 billion, among other measures. If oil and gas prices stay at current levels for the year, Germany's expected economic growth this year would be halved to 0.5%, Mr. Fratscher's organization estimates. Likewise with France. Though it is insulated by having a lot of domestic nuclear energy, the French government has struggled to bring down debt levels. In a country that can't afford to be doing extravagant spending, Mr. Talavera of Oxford Economics said. Greece, Spain, and Portugal make up one relatively bright spot. Once marked by high debt and loose commitments to fiscal responsibility, the three have improved their fiscal positions, either by bringing down debt or, like Spain, by generating strong economic growth. That has allowed them to act first to try to shield households and businesses from rising costs. In recent years, Asia had been making progress reining in deficits that spiked during the COVID-19 pandemic, according to Albert Park, the chief economist at the Asian Development Bank. But trade disruptions stemming from the war are another shock that could push debt higher again. That is a concern especially for those countries that are already walking a fine line on debt sustainability, he said. The wealthier economies of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan have measures such as energy voucher programs to help shield consumers from surging prices. They also have relatively robust foreign exchange reserves and credit lines. The impact is expected to be more pronounced in Asia's emerging markets, said Stefan Angrick, head of Japan and Frontier Market Economics at Moody's Analytics. In Southeast Asia particularly, governments have historically relied on state funding as a shield against energy price volatility, a strategy used aggressively in 2022. At that time, Thailand tapped a state-led fuel fund designed to subsidize costs during price spikes. Midway through 2022, the fund started running a multi-billion-dollar deficit, forcing the government to secure emergency loan guarantees. Thailand has resumed its reliance on the fund, spending tens of millions of dollars daily to subsidize diesel. This month, its balance plunged into a deficit again, prompting the government to consider new loan guarantees. Both Thailand and Indonesia, whose government has signaled plans to increase fuel subsidies, face significant risk of sovereign rating downgrades, the Japanese bank Nomura warned recently. That could raise their borrowing costs. For now, the two countries' financial interventions will limit volatility, Mr. Ongrick of Moody's said. But given fiscal limitations, that's also something that they will not want to keep up for a prolonged period, he added. Among Asia's most vulnerable countries, according to Mr. Ongrick, are Bangladesh and Pakistan, which rely on the Mideast for 2/3 or more of their liquefied natural gas and oil supplies and already face financing pressures. Also at risk are Pacific Island economies including Tonga, Fiji, and Samoa, according to Mr. Park of the Asian Development Bank, as well as the Maldives. While energy costs are still a long way from their 2022 levels, the pressure to spend and the damage to economic growth will compound if the war drags on. Governments with tight budgets will need to use directed subsidies, not broad spending measures, Mr. Park said. At the same time, higher energy prices and inflation will weigh on companies and consumers. There will be bigger and bigger effects on economic output, he said, and that is another shock that will undermine debt sustainability. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The weather is getting wilder, and some see a dire signal in the data. Several of the Earth's systems are changing faster than predicted as global temperatures rise, scientists say, by David Gellis. Scientists who study global warming are currently wrestling with a question that, while seemingly technical, is profoundly consequential. Is climate change accelerating? The debate spilled into the open this month after new research found that the rate of global warming has nearly doubled over the last decade. The findings set scientific circles buzzing, and not all researchers agree with the conclusion. But while the debate about accelerating global warming remains unsettled, a growing number of scientists do agree on another troubling development. The effects of climate change are intensifying in ways that have surprised even experts. Many of the consequences of global warming, such as more intense storms, warming oceans, and melting glaciers, are arriving faster and more powerfully than many scientists had expected. Key impacts are exceeding what models predicted when it comes to extreme weather, the intensification of hurricanes, ice sheet disintegration, and sea level rise, said Michael Mann, a professor of environmental science at the University of Pennsylvania. This week in the United States, extreme weather pushed temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit in parts of California and the Southwest, even as it is still winter. And recent research has found that the duration and intensity of heat waves is accelerating. At the same time, blizzard conditions whipped the upper Midwest, and severe thunderstorms moved east from Arkansas to the Gulf. Around the globe, anomalous weather and shattered records are sending new waves of concern through the scientific community, which was already well aware that some ecosystems are showing signs of intense stress. Almost every part of the world is experiencing these extreme events. An acceleration in the pace of climate change could have dire implications for a planet grappling with more powerful storms, floods, and heat waves. Global average temperatures have already climbed nearly 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, a threshold that is seen as crucial for avoiding the worst effects of climate change. A study about the pace of global warming published on March 6th found that even after accounting for other phenomena, such as volcanic eruptions, solar radiation, and natural variability, the rate of global warming has accelerated since 2015. Over the last 10 years, the warming trend has been faster than in previous decades, said Stephen Rahmstorf, a climate scientist at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in Germany, and one of the authors of the study, which appeared in the journal Geophysical Research Letters. Dr. Mann was among those who were unconvinced. He said the evidence of an uptick in the rate of warming was not statistically detectable, adding that the anomalous warmth in recent years was due to a natural El Niño spike. El Niño is the warm phase of a natural climate pattern that shapes weather patterns worldwide, typically bringing wet and cool conditions with increased flooding to the southern United States, and warmer, drier winters to the northern United States and Canada. It appears that El Niño may return this summer, raising the prospect of even more extreme weather in the months ahead. As the atmosphere warms, so do the seas, which have been showing signs of strain in recent years. Ocean temperatures are hitting record highs around the globe, resulting in mass coral bleaching from the Caribbean to Australia and a sharp decline in fish populations. The oceans, which absorb more than 90% of the excess heat trapped in the Earth's atmosphere, are warming at an accelerating rate, leading to bathtub-like temperatures off the coast of Florida. Each of the past 8 years set a record for ocean heat, with the rate of ocean warming roughly doubling over the past 2 decades compared with the longer-term trend. Marine heat waves now affect more than half of the global ocean in a typical year, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The world experienced its 4th global coral bleaching event starting in 2023, with reefs across the Caribbean, Pacific, and Indian Oceans suffering extensive damage. It was still in progress in 2025. As oceans have warmed, the North and South Poles have both experienced abnormal heat, and in Antarctica, the Thwaites Glacier is melting at an alarming rate. If it breaks up entirely, global sea levels could rise by 2 feet over the course of several decades, putting millions at risk. Antarctic sea ice is also plummeting, with the 4 lowest readings in the 47-year satellite record all occurring in the past 4 years. Outside the poles, other glaciers are also melting at an accelerating rate. Melting glaciers can push sea levels higher. Worldwide, the rate of sea level rise is now picking up pace, more than doubling since satellite measurement began in 1993, leading to warnings about the fate of coastal cities from Miami to Jakarta. The changes to the Earth's natural patterns reveal an interconnected web of ecological systems that are undergoing profound changes beyond what many researchers have predicted. Scientists say the culprit is clear. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, the relentless burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas have been adding heat-trapping gases to the atmosphere, leading to a sharp rise in global temperatures. At the same time, the ability of the planet's natural systems to absorb plant-warming gases like carbon dioxide appear to be diminishing. Taken together, we see the first signs of a planet that is losing resilience or losing strength to buffer heat stress, said Johan Rockström, director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. The consequence of such loss of resilience will be increased rate of warming. And finally today, The Last of Us on 8 Legs. A newly discovered species of spider in the Ecuadorian Amazon mimics a pathogen known as a zombie fungus to protect itself, by Alex Robles Gill. Alexander Bentley, a herpetologist, often leads regular tour groups through a stretch of the Amazon rainforest in Ecuador. He spots lizards, vipers, and frogs, and he especially enjoys pointing out cordyceps, a parasitic fungi that kills its insect hosts and is the inspiration for the post-apocalyptic franchise The Last of Us. But on a rainy night last August, he found something he had never seen before. After flipping a leaf to show his group some cordyceps, he poked the fungal growth, the hairy yellowish tendril-like stalks that are usually a sign that the cordyceps has killed its host. The fungal mass suddenly moved. Mr. Bentley was shocked. Had he found a cordyceps that figured out how to force its host to move around after its tendrils had pierced through the creature's exoskeleton? Mr. Bentley, a founder of Huasca Amazonia, a conservation foundation, collected the specimen and posted his discovery to iNaturalist, a citizen science platform. The site's users said that it was not a fungus but a spider pretending to be infected by one. The fungus the spider was mimicking was Gibellula, a genus of parasitic fungi that belongs to the same family as cordyceps. Users on iNaturalist helped identify the spider's group, which was a rarely seen genus known as Tazanovskia. Mr. Bentley's colleague, David Ricardo Diaz Guevara, An arachnid curator at the National Institute of Biodiversity in Ecuador studied the specimen and was stunned to identify the spider as a new species, Tazanovskia huasca. The two, along with Nadine Dupere of the Museum of Nature, Hamburg, published their findings in the journal Zootaxia last month. Parasitic fungi depend on invertebrates to spread their reproductive units, known as spores. Their life cycle starts when spores land on a creature, such as a spider, and begin to grow inside it. The fungi can digest the creature's insides, interfere with its nervous system, and manipulate its behavior to facilitate spore dispersal, eventually killing the host. This is why they are compared with zombies. To further study the spider, Dr. Diaz-Govera took it to a lab to observe its behavior, hunting patterns, and movement. He then examined the spider's organs and structures. But the fungal mimicry was without a doubt super crazy and very surprising, he said. The spider imitates the fruiting body of the fungus, the horn-like structures on its abdomen, by having abdominal prolongations on its own body. Dr. Diaz-Govera said that effectively, over time, a spider has evolved to realize that if it mimics something that is dead, the chances of being hunted are low. After scouring photos taken by citizen scientists, researchers found spiders with fungal mimicry all over the world. All the spiders belong to the same family, Araneae. The family is also known as orb weavers because of the creature's ability to build conspicuous wheel-shaped webs. But Tazanovskia spiders do not build foraging webs. Instead, they hunt by ambushing their prey and grabbing them in the air with their front legs. This group of spiders are difficult to find in the field. According to the World Spider Catalog, there are 8 described species of Tazanovskia. Individual creatures from the genus have rarely been spotted since it was first described in 1879. Little is known about their role within an ecosystem and their behavior. All but one specimen have been females. Males in this genus tend to be much smaller than females, some as tiny as 1/3 of an inch. Not looking like a spider is possibly an advantage, said Gustavo Horminga, a spider researcher at George Washington University who was not involved with the discovery. Especially if you look like a fungus that nobody is particularly interested in or attracted to. To allow its prey to get close before attacking, the spider might also be mimicking female pheromones that attract a male insect. This study gives you a great example of mimicry in a spider group that is very poorly understood, very poorly represented in collections, with very few specimens of each species, he said. It also shows how much there is to discover about spiders, he added. There are about 53,000 known species of spiders in the World Spider Catalog. Some scientists estimate that another 50,000 to 100,000 species remain to be discovered. They play an essential role in ecosystems by eating and regulating insect populations. Many outcast critters are often seen as creepy and gross, Mr. Bentley said, but they still capture people's attention. Sometimes this creepy gross thing is totally new to science, he said, so that is, in its own right, respectable. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Friday, March 20th issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Chris Wilhelm. Thank you for listening.